Alright folks, I am here today to bring you the origins of Negan and the Saviors in the Walking Dead universe. Now, I've decided to make this part 1 of 3 in what I'm going to call the Savior saga. Initially, I wanted to include the origins and the story all the way up until the end of Season 7, but that turned out to be quite the project, even for me. And to be honest, I think these will fit in separate videos better anyway, as in this one, I'm going to give you Negan's backstory and the rise of the Saviors, and in a part 2, I'll give you the story arc explained, which will include what we see in Season 6 all the way up until the end of Season 7, with the part 3 being All Out War explained. If you're enjoying this type of content, be sure to hit that like button, and if you're feeling generous, hit that sub button as well. Let's get right into this. The Saviors were the largest known faction across the state of Virginia in the Walking Dead universe between 2011 and 2012. Consisting of between 300 and 600 survivors by the time we meet them in Season 6, the Saviors would dominate smaller factions by force across the Washington, D.C. area, and subjected them to their will, while claiming to be restarting society. Led by a madman named Negan, the Saviors' recipe for success consisted of instilling fear in smaller communities via stalking and forms of intimidation such as their iconic whistle. They would then corner their leaders before publicly murdering one of their people in dramatic fashion, right off the bat. Following this display of power, the Saviors would demand monthly offerings of half the community's supplies. Half being what they deemed to be half. Food, weapons, medical supplies, hell, even some of their residents at times. It didn't matter what. As long as they metaphorically neutered the communities, malnourishing them to the point of subservience, while feeding the people loyal to him back at the Sanctuary, an abandoned factory that would become their base of operations. This would go on for nearly 2 years. But how did the Saviors become the powerhouse we see by The Walking Dead Season 6? Negan Smith was a gym teacher before the outbreak, and not a very good one at that. Getting into fights with parents and catching himself in an assault charge, losing the job he grew to love. He was unfaithful to his wife Lucille, and overall, kind of a dick.
You suck ass.
However, when the time came for the dead to rise and walk the earth, Negan began to truly value the little he had, Lucille, who was slowly dying of cancer, but stuck by his side despite it all, as she could see the man he had become. Negan would leave their house to track down a rumor of a traveling van of doctors. Lucille would beg him to stay with her, but he couldn't just sit there and let her die. So after 6 weeks of tracking down the traveling doctors Franklin and Laura, they supplied Negan with the chemotherapy for Lucille, and a wooden baseball bat for protection, and sent him on his way as an act of good faith to the desperate man. However, soon after leaving, he is captured by a gang named Valak's Vipers, a small but brutal group of men. The Vipers torture Negan into revealing the whereabouts of the traveling doctors in exchange for his freedom, as a group with something as valuable as chemo would have other goods to rob. Negan is apprehensive to give them up as they gave him the supplies to save his wife, but gives in anyway out of desperation to get back to Lucille. The Vipers stay true to their word and show him mercy, sending him on his way with the chemo. But when arriving back home, Negan would discover Lucille turned, as she took her own life as a way to set him free from his obligations to her. Grief-stricken, Negan burns down the house and marches straight back to the Vipers' hideout. With the traveling doctors now captured by the gang, Negan would wrap his bat with barbed wire and beat the men down, rescuing Laura and Franklin, effectively becoming Negan's first followers. Or at the very least, Laura, as we see her with the Saviors in the modern day. It's funny how someone who started off helping strangers could be influenced into wrongdoing by someone like Negan. But hey, that's the game you play when surviving in the apocalypse. In honor of his late wife, Negan would name his murder bat Lucille, for some reason, and would go on to cherish it as his most valuable possession. Negan had never killed anyone before then, but now that he let the beast out of the cage, he wouldn't be able to put him back. Negan's sense of morality would die that night, allowing him to begin his journey into becoming the tyrant of the saviors we see by 2012. Despite his influence and growing following, Negan was not the original leader of the group occupying the Sanctuary, the abandoned factory outside of Washington, D.C. Instead, he would overthrow the incompetent leader with the help of Simon, his sadistic right-hand man. Throughout 2010 and possibly early 2011, Simon led a group of bandits of his own, plundering small communities in the Washington, D.C. area and forcing their victims to provide resources for them. One of these communities being what would eventually become Oceanside. Simon had forced the community to work under his tyranny, but without the numbers to maintain the fear, the group would rebel against Simon's forces, but would lose the battle. As punishment, Simon would line up every male in the community and execute them, regardless of age. The surviving women would abandon their community in fear of Simon's return, and would eventually settle in a motor camp by the coast, where they would hide from the outside world for the next 2 years. Now, it's unclear exactly when Negan and Simon came into contact, but it's more than likely Negan's ways of ruling originated from Simon's group of plunderers, as the groups would merge to form one big organization under Negan's lead, and adapt Simon's way of ruling over smaller factions, eventually leading to the annexation of the Sanctuary and its people. It's unclear how Negan was able to tame someone as unpredictable as Simon, but it is clear he thought he could use him as an asset, making him his right-hand man and second in command of the Saviors. Negan, however, was not wasteful with human life, and viewed people as a resource, electing to only kill when it was absolutely necessary, which was still a lot for a psycho like Negan, but it meant there was a rhyme and a reason to his madness. So Simon's way of just killing anyone who opposed would not fly, but this rule would not sit well with him over the coming years. Once order was established, Negan would give his saviors their iconic name, in honor of the school's mascot he used to teach at. But it was his belief that's exactly what they were. Saviors of the wasteland, despite their atrocities. If the communities under their rule were light on supplies, they would face the wrath of whichever sick-in-the-head lieutenant would be best for the job, usually resulting in another single casualty. Again, seen as anything but a waste to Negan, as it reinforced the capabilities of the saviors to their victims. Even public executions had their place in his society. People were a resource, but a resource for what? Rebuilding the world? Or ruling it with an iron fist? They would claim this was not tyranny and instead bartering, as they would take half the supplies in exchange for protecting their communities by taking out the dead, although we don't actually see them do this that much. So once again, I say,
bullshit!
For the most part, Negan would operate from the shadows, sending his lieutenants to deal with the work involving communities, only appearing in the flesh when dealing with particularly stubborn groups. Some of the communities under the Savior's rule weren't even sure if he was a real guy, but most across Virginia knew the name, as he instilled a cult-like worship of himself among his followers through his charisma and ability to keep them safe, and would grow their camaraderie and sense of unity by referring to them all as Negan, something the Saviors would actually take kindly to, while stroking Negan's ego further in the process.
I am Negan! Damn right you are! We all are!
Most of these Saviors were rescued out in the wasteland, so a lot of their loyalty to Negan was genuine. They were thankful to have a roof over their head, as surviving alone out there is a sure way to die given enough time. Not every Savior was bad to the core, but all did whatever they had to do to survive. And in the end, it was better than being left out in the wasteland to die. At least to most. While the Saviors were out causing havoc across the Washington, D.C. area, and their numbers were growing rapidly, regular workers incapable of combat lived on the factory floor and would work for their rations on an extremely unfair and uneven point system. These workers would even kneel for Negan, some out of fear, but most actually out of loyalty. As we see how deep Negan has brainwashed these people later on in Season 8, as they appear to genuinely worship him, despite their atrocious living conditions. I guess living in a world like this, you'd be thankful for whatever you got, despite how little it may really be.
Thank you, Negan. Thank God for you.
Although this could just be attributed to fear, it goes to show to which extent people will follow you if you keep them protected. Actually protected. Not the fake bullshit they preach to the communities under their rule. Those who refused to fall in line would be locked away and put on fence duty until they complied, which consisted of stringing up walkers and impaling them all around the sanctuary's perimeter, as not only a scare tactic for other survivors, but a factory-wide camouflage as the scent deterred the dead from gathering at the fence. A fate for those inside the sanctuary that would not lead to loyalty would be women who were selected to become Negan's wives. That's right, wives plural. Negan felt he did not have to play by the old rules and wanted to have as many wives as possible, but we know this was probably just a way for him to suppress his grief for Lucille. However, for the women chosen, this was anything but an honor, as although Negan would mask it as a choice to marry him, the reality is these women were coerced, as most of them were factory floor workers, struggling to provide for their families, and the only way to get the medical supplies or food rations would be to marry Negan, something in which there was no going back from. If one of his wives were caught with another man, Negan would burn half his face with an iron, as in his words, the rules keep them alive. Although it seems most of these rules don't actually apply to him.
Ironic.
Negan would see these people as traitors in his eyes, and would in some cases use them as his personal punching bag. But we see, for some, such as Dwight, Negan would push a little too far. But that's a story we'll get into another day.
He got the iron. And then I married a super hot wife.
Negan had everyone under his thumb with his strict ways of leading, but one of his biggest rules was to never kill children. Yeah, I think the writers just want us to forget the whole Carl head bashing thing, but whatever. When one of his soldiers would go against this rule, Negan would put them down, no exceptions. We can see this through flashbacks in Dead City, as a man named the Croat once acted as Negan's personal psychopath. But one day, he went too far, torturing and killing a child from one of the communities under their rule, under the suspicion she was a spy. Although Croat was an asset with his remorseless ways and knowledge in alternative energy, Negan would shoot him in the head when his back was turned. Negan's way of running a society doesn't work if his men go rogue. Although the Croat would survive his gunshot and crawl his way to Manhattan, we can see Negan took no pleasure in any of this situation. It genuinely hurt him to see the child suffer, so somewhere deep down, the man who traveled for weeks to save his wife was still in there. but he would push it down and suppress that side of him as he needed to be the unforgiving leader he was. As on top of the growing numbers, they would expand to have outposts across the Washington, D.C. area. And with that, the Saviors would become the powerhouse we see by Season 6. Negan's influence across Virginia would be unmatched, until his path would be crossed by Rick Grimes, a man that would one day threaten everything Negan had built.
Sooner or later, you were gonna meet someone like me. You can't save